Ethan Core had always believed that life was something he could control, at least in small, predictable ways. As a young diplomat for Earth, he had studied interstellar law, politics, and alien cultures, imagining himself as a negotiator who could solve crises with calm words and careful reasoning. He never imagined, not for a second, that he would be summoned one morning to the highest council chamber and told he had been chosen for a marriage he had not consented to. The council was stern, their faces hard under the bright lights of the chamber. "Ethan Core," one of the senior members said, "you have been selected to marry Princess Lyria of Valoria. This is not a request. It is a matter of interstellar importance." Ethan blinked, certain he had misheard. What?" he asked, his voice uncertain, though it quickly hardened with defiance. "I'm a diplomat, this is insane! I can't marry an alien princess. I don't even know her." "You will know her soon enough," the councilman replied. "Your refusal is not an option. The treaty depends on your union. It is the only way to ensure peace between Earth and the Valorians. You must understand, Ethan, that your choice is no longer yours. The galaxy is counting on you." Ethan's stomach twisted. The Valorians were legendary across human colonies. They were beautiful in ways that humans could scarcely comprehend, but their culture, powers, and mysterious ways inspired fear. Stories circulated of their abilities, how they could manipulate emotions, influence the environment, even alter gravity subtly. And Lyria, the princess he was to marry, was rumored to be cursed. He had read the reports in secret, knowing curiosity might someday require him to understand Valorians better. The whispers about Lyria were chilling. Her powers were said to bring disaster, even death, to anyone who became too close. Cursed! They called her... And now, he was expected to spend the rest of his life with her. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Officials handed him documents, hollow briefings, and instructions on protocol. He was to leave immediately for Valoria aboard a sleek council cruiser, accompanied by 2 guards and a translator who spoke Valorian fluently. Ethan tried to protest, but the council had already adjourned, leaving him alone in the chamber with the echo of their words ringing in his ears. By the time he reached the cruiser, Ethan felt a strange mix of fear, anger, and reluctant curiosity. He stared out the viewport as Earth receded into the distance, wondering what awaited him. The stars stretched endlessly, and somewhere among them, Lyria waited. A princess of legend, a woman who might be dangerous, terrifying, or worse, alluring, in ways he could not predict. When the cruiser finally arrived in orbit around Valoria, Ethan's first view of the planet took his breath away. The planet shimmered with colors unlike anything Earth had seen. Cities floated among clouds of soft light, crystal spires rising like fingers to touch the sky. The forests below pulsed faintly with energy, reacting to something beyond human understanding. The beauty was overwhelming, almost otherworldly, and for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of excitement mixed with his anxiety. He was escorted from the cruiser by Valorian attendants. They were tall, slender, and elegant, with glowing markings along their skin that shifted with their emotions. Their eyes were deep pools of color, reflecting light and mood simultaneously. Ethan's translator whispered explanations, but he hardly noticed. Every movement, every glance from the attendant seemed purposeful, precise, and slightly intimidating. And then he saw her. Lyria. The princess stood at the entrance of the palace, her presence commanding yet strangely quiet. She was tall, with a grace that made Ethan's breath catch. Her eyes glowed faintly with violet light, and her long hair seemed to shimmer, reflecting the floating crystals around her. She wore a ceremonial gown that flowed around her like liquid starlight, and her expression was unreadable. She looked at him, and for a moment, neither spoke. Ethan felt a weight in her gaze, an awareness that made him suddenly conscious of his every movement. The legends had not done her justice. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something else, something that suggested she was far more than the stories of a cursed princess. Finally, she spoke. her voice melodic and strange. "You are the human who has been chosen," she said simply. There was no accusation in her tone, only observation. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped forward, unsure how to respond. "Yes, I am," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I understand this is important for the treaty." Her gaze softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Do not confuse duty with desire," she said. Ethan frowned, not sure whether she meant it as a warning or an insight. The palace itself was another marvel. Crystal towers spiraled upward, rooms that seemed alive with light and energy. Plants reacted to their presence, petals opening or closing depending on mood. Even the air felt charged, and Ethan realized that every step he took was accompanied by a subtle hum of power. Lyria walked beside him with ease, her every movement deliberate, yet she seemed to radiate a quiet warmth that contrasted with the intimidating reputation she carried. Over the following days, Ethan struggled with the culture shock of Valorian life. Meals were ceremonial, communication layered with subtle cues, and every glance could convey 100 meanings. Lyria watched him constantly, her violet eyes assessing, curious, and occasionally amused. Despite himself, Ethan found her intriguing. She was intelligent, quick, and often playful in ways that human etiquette had never taught him to expect from a royal. Yet the whispers persisted in his mind, the curse, the danger she represented. He tried to keep his distance, reasoning that protocol demanded it. But the more he observed her, the more he noticed small, almost imperceptible moments of kindness. The way she paused to adjust a guard's cloak, how she encouraged a servant learning the human language, or how she smiled faintly when he stumbled over Valorian etiquette. Then came the first incident that made him truly realize that Lyria's so-called curse was no ordinary legend. Ethan had been walking through the palace gardens, attempting to understand the strange energy that seemed to flow through the plants and crystals, when a sudden shift startled him. A small tree, shimmering with Valorian light, bent toward him as if reaching out. Flowers bloomed violently, petals scattering into the air like sparks. A crystal walkway trembled. Ethan stepped back, heart pounding. Lyria appeared silently beside him, her hand reaching out to calm the chaos. The plants and crystals responded instantly to her touch, the turmoil easing as if she were a conductor controlling a symphony. "Do not fear me," she said softly, her glow fading as she spoke. "This is who I am." It is not a curse. It is energy.
Ethan blinked, realizing that the stories he had read were exaggerations at best, lies at worst.
She was not cursed. She was extraordinary. The power she possessed had been misunderstood, feared by those too cautious or ignorant to understand it. For the first time, Ethan felt a spark of genuine curiosity and admiration. Here was someone unlike anyone he had ever met. Dangerous? Perhaps unpredictable? Yes, but fascinating, intelligent, and beautiful in ways that drew him in despite the warnings of every human tale he had ever heard. The days that followed were filled with lessons in etiquette, language, and diplomacy. Ethan learned to navigate the subtle currents of Valorian culture, often guided by Lyria herself. She was patient, clever, and occasionally mischievous, teasing him gently about human habits, while challenging him to think beyond his own species' limitations. And in the quiet moments when the palace was still and the floating lights of the city shimmered above, Ethan found himself thinking not of duty, not of fear, but of her, the princess, the so-called cursed one, who was slowly revealing that there was far more to her than anyone had ever believed. Ethan did not yet know what awaited him in the days to come. Rogue factions, political intrigue, and the very limits of human and Valorian understanding were just around the corner. But in that moment, as he walked beside Lyria in the gardens of a world that seemed alive with possibility, he allowed himself a rare thought. Perhaps this marriage would not be a punishment. Perhaps it would be an adventure unlike any other. And perhaps, just perhaps, The princess was exactly the kind of person he had been waiting to meet all his life. Ethan had expected the days on Valoria to be difficult, filled with cold formality and endless lessons in alien etiquette. Instead, he found himself increasingly drawn into the strange rhythm of the palace and the world around him. Lyria, the so-called cursed princess, was unlike any person he had ever met, and her presence made even the most ordinary moments feel charged with something extraordinary. The first morning, he woke to a soft, humming light spilling through the crystalline walls of his chamber. The palace was alive in ways he could not yet describe. Crystals shifted gently as if breathing, and the air seemed to carry a subtle vibration that responded to thought and emotion. Ethan had never experienced anything like it. The humans who had written reports about Valoria had spoken only of beauty and danger, but the palace was more than both. It was a living organism, responsive and aware. He dressed in a formal human tunic, feeling awkward as he tried to blend in with the flowing robes of the Valorian attendants. He had learned quickly that appearances mattered, and that even small mistakes in posture or speech could offend. Lyria watched him silently from the hallway, her violet eyes glowing faintly, like light reflecting off distant stars. "You are stiff?" she said softly, her voice musical and calm. "Relax." "The palace is not a battlefield," Ethan tried to smile. "I'm afraid of making mistakes," he admitted. "I don't want to offend anyone." She tilted her head, a small, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. "Humans are predictable," she said. "You worry too much. Sometimes it is better to observe first, then act." It was the kind of advice that could have sounded condescending if delivered by anyone else. But from her, it felt genuine. Ethan realized that Lyria was not just a ruler, but also someone who understood the weight of responsibility. And yet there was playfulness in her tone, a teasing quality that made him relax despite himself. As days passed, Ethan began to notice the curse for himself. It was subtle at first. In the palace garden, a cluster of flowers began to bloom wildly when Lyria laughed, petals spinning in the air, before settling gently on the crystalline pathways. A small crystal fountain tilted and shimmered as though reaching for her touch. The palace staff whispered and moved quickly around her, careful not to disturb her mood. The humans accompanying Ethan looked nervous, exchanging uneasy glances as they observed what seemed like uncontrolled power. But Ethan began to understand. It was not a curse in the sense of danger. It was simply the natural extension of her being. Lyria's emotions influenced her surroundings, not violently, but in ways that required respect and understanding. He noticed how she moved deliberately, how her gestures were careful when her mood shifted, and how she could calm a room with a mere glance. One afternoon, as they walked through the floating gardens of the palace, Lyria turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. "Do humans ever see beauty in things they cannot control?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost thoughtful. Ethan frowned, thinking. But usually, we fear what we do not understand." Her violet eyes met his, steady and curious. "Exactly. Fear blinds people. But understanding can create something far stronger than fear." For the first time, Ethan realized that she was speaking not just about him or humans, but about herself, about the rumors, the legends, and the whispered warnings that had followed her all her life. The cursed princess, as everyone called her, had lived under suspicion and isolation, and yet she moved through the palace with a quiet grace and strength that was impossible to ignore. Their growing connection was soon tested. A warning arrived from the outer palace perimeter. Rogue Valorians had been sighted near the city, factions that opposed the treaty with humans. They believed Lyria's marriage to Ethan threatened their autonomy and the future of their species. For a moment, the palace was filled with tension so thick it seemed to ripple through the very air. Guards moved quickly, the staff whispered urgently, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Lyria remained calm, her aura glowing faintly with energy. "They think fear will stop progress," she said quietly, but there was a sharp edge to her voice. "We will show them it will not." Ethan, feeling both fear and responsibility, followed her into the courtyard where the disturbances had been reported. The rogue faction arrived not with weapons alone, but with strange devices that twisted gravity and manipulated light, designed to disorient anyone who approached. Ethan's first instinct was to freeze, but he remembered his training. Using quick thinking and human ingenuity, he manipulated the environment, diverting the attackers' devices and creating safe pathways for the palace guards to counterattack. Lyria, observing him, tilted her head in approval. She extended her hands, and the air around them seemed to respond, guiding the flow of light and energy in ways Ethan had never seen. Together they moved in sync, human strategy and Valorian power merging seamlessly. By the time the intruders were forced to retreat, Ethan felt a mixture of exhilaration and awe. Lyria's abilities, so feared and misunderstood, were now revealed as extraordinary gifts when combined with the human mind. That evening, after the chaos had ended, Ethan found himself sitting with Lyria in one of the quiet gardens, the floating lights of Valoria reflected in her eyes, making her seem almost otherworldly. She said nothing at first, simply observing him, and for a long moment he felt an unusual calm, as though the world itself had paused. "You are different from what I expected," she finally said. Her violet eyes glimmered with curiosity. "Humans are unpredictable, but in ways that can be very interesting." Ethan chuckled nervously. "I suppose Valorians are unpredictable too?" he replied. "I never expected any of this." "The powers, the palace, you?" She smiled faintly, a rare warmth that softened her usually serious expression. "And yet, you adapt. You do not fear me as others do." "That is admirable." Ethan felt a strange pride, a sense that he had begun to understand her, not just as a diplomat or a curiosity, but as a person. And he realized that the spark he had felt on the first day, something he had tried to ignore, was growing into something more tangible, something that made his heart race in ways he could not fully explain. Over the following days, their interactions became more natural. Lyria taught him about her culture, guiding him through the subtle currents of emotion that governed Valorian life. She teased him gently, challenging him with riddles and puzzles that seemed playful but had deeper lessons in understanding her people. Ethan found himself laughing, thinking, and sometimes stumbling, but always learning. One evening, they walked through a forest of glowing crystal trees, their light responding to every shift in mood. Ethan reached out tentatively to touch a branch, and it shimmered under his fingers. Lyria watched him closely, a small smile on her lips. "Do you see now?" she asked softly. "This is not a curse. It is life, responding to life. I only ever wished someone would see it this way." Ethan felt a lump in his throat, understanding more than words could convey. The cursed princess was not cursed at all. She was powerful, misunderstood, and extraordinary, and despite himself, he realized he was beginning to care for her. It was in those quiet, fleeting moments, walking among glowing trees, sharing thoughts without fear of judgment, laughing at small misunderstandings, that Ethan started to see the truth. Lyria was not someone to fear. She was someone to respect, to understand, and perhaps, in ways he had not expected, to like. Perhaps even more than like. As night fell over the floating city, the stars reflecting in the crystalline towers, Ethan knew that the path ahead would be challenging. Rogue factions still threatened the palace. Humans and Valorians alike remained wary of their union. But for the first time, he felt a sense of partnership, of trust, and even a hint of excitement. The so-called curse was not a danger. It was a gift, a mystery, and perhaps the very thing that made Lyria exactly the kind of person he had been waiting to meet. Ethan did not yet understand everything about her powers, or the politics that surrounded them. But he knew one thing clearly. For the first time in his life, he was not facing the universe alone. And the strange, beautiful, dangerous princess beside him had begun to change everything. And somewhere deep inside, he admitted, just quietly, that he was beginning to hope this forced marriage might become something far more remarkable than he had ever imagined. The following days were tense, filled with a strange mix of calm and danger. Ethan had begun to understand Lyria's powers, but the Valorian palace was never truly at rest. Whispers of dissent floated through the corridors like shadows, and Ethan could feel the eyes of humans and Valorians alike observing him wherever he went. Some were curious, some suspicious, and some openly hostile. He had been told that trust was rare on Valoria, but he hadn't realized just how fragile it could be until now. Lyria, however, moved with an unshakable grace. She treated the palace as her world, her energy flowing in every corner. She taught Ethan how to sense the subtle shifts in light and sound, to read the emotions that hovered in the air like invisible auras. For a human, it was overwhelming at first, but Ethan found that observing her closely made it easier. She was patient, guiding him without ever losing her temper, though she sometimes teased him mercilessly when he stumbled. "You are slow," she said one morning, walking beside him in the floating gardens. "The energy is alive, but you hesitate. You fear it too much."
"I am not afraid," Ethan protested, though he knew she could see the lie in his eyes. "Ah, but fear is always visible," she replied with a sly smile.
"Even in humans, you just hide it badly." He laughed, a little embarrassed, but also fascinated by her insight. She had an uncanny ability to see through him, to notice the smallest thoughts and reactions. And yet she did not judge. That was what made her so remarkable, and, despite the warnings of others, so compelling. It was during one of these training walks that the first real test of their bond arrived. The palace alarms rang sharply, vibrating through the air in ways Ethan had never experienced. Lights flickered, and the floating gardens shimmered with a restless energy. A rogue faction had infiltrated the city. They were humans and Valorians who opposed the treaty, armed with strange devices designed to disorient and disrupt. Ethan's first instinct was to panic, but Lyria's calm aura steadied him. She raised her hands, and the energy around her responded, forming barriers of light that shimmered against the attacks. Ethan realized that the stories of her curse were only part of the truth. Her abilities were precise, controlled, and terrifyingly powerful in the right hands. "Stay close," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "Watch me. Learn. Trust me." Together, they moved through the gardens, dodging energy blasts and deflecting attacks. Ethan noticed that when he anticipated the rogue device's movements and acted, the plants and crystals seemed to respond in kind, aiding their escape and counterattacks. It was a synergy he had never imagined possible. Human ingenuity and Valorian power working as one. By the time the intruders were driven back, the palace was a mix of chaos and wonder. Guards were tending to minor injuries, staff were repairing disrupted devices, and Ethan found himself breathing heavily, exhilarated and terrified at the same time. Lyria turned to him, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light.
"You adapted quickly," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "You are more than a human diplomat."
"You are useful." Ethan felt a surge of relief and pride. "I just followed your lead," he admitted. "But you make it seem effortless." She smiled softly, the first time he had seen her expression fully relaxed. "I have had practice. You have potential if you allow yourself to trust it." In the days that followed, the palace began to settle, but Ethan noticed subtle changes. Both humans and Valorians watched him differently, some with suspicion, others with cautious respect. And he began to see a different side of Lyria as well. Away from the formalities and the threats, she revealed her fears, dreams, and memories. She spoke of the isolation she had endured, the misunderstandings that had labeled her as cursed, and the loneliness of being powerful in a world that feared power. Ethan listened, understanding more than he had expected. He realized that her so-called curse was never about harming others. It was about being extraordinary in a world that was not ready to understand her. And in that realization, his admiration for her deepened. One evening, as they walked along the crystal pathways above the palace gardens, Lyria stopped and pointed to the floating lights that drifted like fireflies in the twilight. "These lights," she said, "react to mood and intent."
You saw them during the attack. They respond to focus, trust, and emotion.
Most humans would be terrified of them. Most humans fear what they cannot control. Ethan reached out, letting the lights dance across his fingers. They shimmered and pulsed in response, gentle and alive. "I think I understand," he said slowly. "It's like energy that listens to us, not the other way around." Lyria nodded, her gaze steady on him. "Exactly." "You understand more than you realize. That is why
Appreciate your presence." For a moment, they simply stood together, observing the lights, the quiet hum of the palace, and the world around them.
Ethan felt a strange warmth, an unspoken connection forming between them. It was not yet love, not fully, but it was something undeniable. A bond forged through understanding, danger, and shared experience. Their growing closeness was soon tested again. During a routine exploration of the palace archives, Ethan stumbled upon a hidden section of the Valorian library. It was filled with ancient scrolls, crystalline data modules, and records that had been kept secret for generations. As he studied the writings, he realized something extraordinary. Lyria's powers had been misunderstood for centuries. Her abilities, far from being dangerous, were linked to life, communication, and connection. They could heal, strengthen, and enhance understanding between beings, not harm them. When Lyria discovered what he had found, she smiled softly, a mixture of relief and quiet joy. "You see it," she said.
You see what I have always known. They called me cursed because they could not understand.
"But you understand." Ethan felt a surge of admiration. "I don't just understand," he said. "I respect it. I respect." Her expression softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. "Then perhaps you are not so human after all," she teased lightly, though there was a hint of sincerity in her voice. The bond between them grew stronger as they faced more challenges together. Rogue factions continued to stir unrest, but Ethan and Lyria learned to rely on each other in ways neither had anticipated. He used strategy and quick thinking, while she channeled her energy to manipulate the environment, protect allies, and counter threats. Together, they became a formidable team, gaining respect from those who had doubted them, and earning admiration from unlikely quarters. One night, after a particularly intense day of planning and training, Ethan found himself alone with Lyria in a secluded part of the palace gardens. The crystal tree shimmered softly, responding to the quiet tension in the air. He looked at her, realizing how much he had come to admire her courage, intelligence, and resilience.
You are...
He began, unsure how to finish.
You are incredible. I don't think I've ever met anyone like you.
Lyria's violet eyes met his, steady and curious.
You make me feel understood, she said simply.
More than anyone ever has. For a moment, neither spoke. The energy around them pulsed gently, responding to their emotions, reflecting the unspoken connection that had grown between them. Ethan felt a rush of warmth, a mixture of fear and hope. He knew that the dangers they faced were far from over, but he also knew that he did not face them alone. In that quiet, suspended moment, he realized something profound. The so-called cursed princess was not a threat. She was a partner, a guide, and perhaps, in ways he had never imagined, someone he could care for deeply. The spark that had begun on his first day had grown into a flame of curiosity, admiration, and something more tender, something he could not yet name. The night ended with a shared silence, walking through gardens that responded to their presence, lights floating and twisting around them like tiny stars. Ethan understood that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, political intrigue, and perhaps danger beyond imagination. But he also understood that with Lyria by his side, there was nothing he could not face. And in that realization, a new hope took root within him. The hope that the marriage forced upon him, the union he had once dreaded, might become something extraordinary. Not just a treaty, not just a duty, but a connection that could transcend worlds, misunderstandings, and fear, something powerful, extraordinary, and entirely their own. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, but both had been quietly waiting for. The day of the formal ceremony arrived, and the palace shimmered with anticipation. Humans and Valorians alike had gathered to witness the union that had long been spoken of in whispers, rumors, and warnings. The streets of the floating city sparkled with light, and the crystal towers reflected the sun like 1,000 mirrors, dazzling and alive.
Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him.
This was no longer about him and Lyria alone. It was about bridging two species, calming fears, and proving that understanding could overcome prejudice. He stood beside Lyria, who was radiant in ceremonial robes that glowed faintly with her aura. Her violet eyes met his, steady and confident, though he could see the smallest flicker of nerves. Despite her immense power, she was human in her emotions, vulnerable in ways she rarely allowed others to see. Ethan swallowed, trying to steady himself. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Lyria gave a small smile. "I have been ready my entire life," she replied. "I only needed someone willing to see me as I am." The ceremony began with the arrival of dignitaries, their expressions a mixture of awe, skepticism, and curiosity. Human representatives whispered nervously, unsure whether the princess would display the chaos they had been warned of. Valorian leaders watched with cautious respect, their auras flickering like candlelight. And at the center of it all, Ethan realized, was the test of trust, not just between him and Lyria, but between entire civilizations. When the moment came to exchange vows, Ethan felt his heart pounding. He looked at Lyria and saw not the so-called cursed princess, not the stories of disaster that had followed her, but a person of extraordinary courage, intelligence, and strength. She was alive in ways humans could barely comprehend, and yet he had learned to navigate her world, to understand her, and to trust her. "I, Ethan Core," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves, "pledge to stand by you, to honor and respect you, and to walk beside you through whatever challenges may come." Lyria's gaze softened, and her aura pulsed gently with the warmth of acknowledgement. "And I, Lyria of Valoria," she replied, her voice clear and melodic, "pledge to share my life, my strength, and my understanding with you. Together, we will face the future, not as separate worlds, but as partners, as equals, as one." As the words were spoken, the palace responded. Crystals along the walls shimmered brighter, flowers in the gardens bloomed in radiant colors, and the energy in the air shifted from tension to celebration. Humans gasped in awe, and even the Valorians who had doubted the union began to murmur among themselves. Ethan realized that Lyria's so-called curse had transformed into a display of her true power, not destructive, but beautiful, harmonious, and inspiring. After the ceremony, Ethan and Lyria walked through the palace gardens, the floating lights reflecting in their eyes. For a moment, there was no protocol, no expectation, only the quiet joy of understanding and connection. "You handled yourself well today," Lyria said softly, her hand brushing against his, "even in front of all those eyes." Ethan smiled, feeling a rare sense of pride.
"I had a good teacher," he replied, You taught me how to see things differently.
How to trust, how to act without fear. She tilted her head, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. And yet, you surprised me. Your calmness, your choices, they were human, but extraordinary. You are not afraid to step into the unknown. That is why Her voice faltered slightly, and for the first time, Ethan saw a hesitation in her usually confident demeanor. Why you what? He asked gently, taking her hand. Why I trust you, she finished, her violet eyes meeting his, more than anyone else ever has. Ethan's chest tightened. For weeks, he had struggled to reconcile fear, duty, and admiration for her. But now, standing together, he understood that what he felt went beyond respect or fascination. It was care, it was trust, and yes, it was something deeper, something that made his pulse quicken and his thoughts spin. As the evening progressed, they were called to address the assembled dignitaries once more. Ethan took a deep breath, knowing this would be a defining moment for both humans and Valorians. He spoke of unity, of understanding, of the importance of seeing beyond fear. He praised Lyria not as a ruler of an alien world, but as a person of remarkable courage and wisdom. His words carried sincerity, confidence, and hope. Lyria followed, her presence commanding yet graceful. She demonstrated her abilities, carefully controlling her aura to calm tensions and inspire admiration. Where humans had expected chaos, they saw beauty. Where Valorians had expected misjudgment, they saw partnership. Together, Ethan and Lyria showed the power of trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time Ethan felt a sense of triumph, not just for himself, but for what they had achieved together. They had transformed fear into understanding, suspicion into respect, and a forced marriage into a symbol of unity and hope. Later, as the crowds dispersed and the city lights reflected like stars on the crystal towers, Ethan and Lyria found themselves alone once more. The energy around them pulsed gently, responding to the quiet rhythm of their steps. You are exactly my type, Ethan said, a smile spreading across his face, half teasing, half sincere. Lyria's eyes widened slightly, a soft laugh escaping her lips. Exactly your type, she repeated, her voice teasing. After all you said about humans being predictable? I meant it, he replied. You're clever, brave, powerful, and you make me feel like I belong in your world, not just as a human observer, but as someone who can truly stand beside you. For a long moment she said nothing, simply observing him, her aura shifting subtly with amusement and warmth. Then, slowly, she stepped closer and took his hand in hers. Then, perhaps this marriage, she said softly, is not a punishment after all. Perhaps it is exactly as it should be. Ethan felt a rush of relief and joy. Weeks of tension, danger, and misunderstanding had led to this moment, and now it was clear. The princess of legend, the one they called cursed, was not only extraordinary, but also entirely his match. They walked together through the gardens, hand in hand, the floating lights twirling around them. Ethan realized that the challenges of the past weeks had forged a bond stronger than duty alone. They had faced threats, cultural misunderstandings, and the weight of expectation. And yet, they had emerged not only victorious, but connected in ways neither had anticipated. As they reached the highest balcony of the palace, overlooking the shimmering city and the crystal forest below, Ethan turned to Lyria. Whatever comes next, he said, we face it together. Not as human and alien, not as ruler and diplomat, but as partners. Her violet eyes met his, steady and unwavering. Together, she agreed. The city below glowed with the reflection of their unity, a symbol of hope and understanding that stretched far beyond the palace walls. The rogue factions would still stir, and the galaxy would continue to challenge them. But Ethan and Lyria had proven something fundamental. that courage, trust, and empathy could bridge worlds. That night, as the floating lights drifted through the crystal towers and the air pulsed with gentle energy, Ethan and Lyria stood side by side. They were not just a marriage of convenience. They were a partnership forged in trust, challenge, and understanding. And in the quiet moments, away from politics and expectations, they allowed themselves to be just Ethan and Lyria, two beings from different worlds who had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for. Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of fear and duty lift. The so-called curse had been a misunderstanding. The princess he had feared had become the companion he had never known he wanted. And as they gazed together at the shimmering horizon, he realized that this was only the beginning. Their journey would continue, filled with adventure, discovery, and perhaps danger. But now, he would never face it alone. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood what it meant to belong, not to a planet, not to a species, but to someone who saw him as he truly was, and someone he would follow to the stars, if necessary. And Lyria, the princess who had been called cursed, smiled softly, knowing that she had found someone who not only understood her power, but embraced it, who trusted her fully, and who had become the partner she had been waiting for all her life. Together, they walked into the glowing night of Valoria, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the galaxy would throw at them. United, strong, and utterly unstoppable. They forced him to marry the cursed alien princess. But she turned out to be exactly his type.